I kind of miss the era of the classic system or the mini system because I feel like it was a very fun time, especially if you are more of a retro gamer. Now, plug and play systems have been around for a very long time. You used to walk into places like Family Dollar or Dollar General around the holiday season and see these cheaply made units made by, usually at that times, At Games, which wasn't really renowned for their quality like they are now, and it was a basic sort of experience. Not very good. You had a bunch of different systems there as well. But then you had Nintendo come along and kind of revitalize this whole market and really make it a market in and of itself with the NES Classic. Now, the NES Classic absolutely took the world by storm. Essentially, what it was a shrunk down NES preloaded with ROMs onto it that you would plug into your modern television and be able to play these NES games in full HD glory. There were quality of life improvements done as well, such as being able to do save states and whatnot, and it really sort of sparked a revolution of these mini consoles because other console manufacturers, either present or past, saw this as a potential money-making opportunity. Sega came along and did their own Genesis Mini that was well received. They even did a sequel to that as well. And Television and Atari started dipping their toes back into these sort of systems with higher quality. Hell, even PlayStation made one that, it wasn't very good. They did PAL ROMs on that only ran at 50 hertz. But I think for a lot of people, one of the best systems had to be the Super NES Classic. Of course, having SNES games on this device and even having Star Fox 2 be officially released for the very, very first time by Nintendo themselves, it was a big deal. Everyone loved these systems. But then Nintendo just kind of stopped. And many people were wondering, well, you did the NES, you did the Super Nintendo. Well, where's the N64 Classic? It made perfect sense. It seemed like something that people would have wanted. But Nintendo never released that. And we're going to talk about why that is and potentially why there's at least a little glimmer of hope when it comes to this. Now, in order to understand the N64 Classic and how it would work, you kind of got to look at the N64 as a system itself. Now, this was a revolutionary system. It was the first time that 3D graphics were kind of a standard thing. It, of course, introduced things like the analog stick, and admittedly, kind of a weird controller, but it's something that I've grown to love, even though I hold it really weird, according to 95% of the people in the world. Maybe I'm not the weird one. Maybe you are, pal. Maybe you are. But the architecture of the N64 hasn't exactly been very emulation friendly over the years. You could run a Dreamcast on essentially anything and get perfect compatibility, but N64 always has been a little bit trickier. When you look at N64 products that are either on the market or were supposed to come to the market, many of these things never came out, and the ones that did come out just weren't very good. Going back into history, we of course had Hyperkin. Hyperkin teased two different projects related to the Nintendo 64. One was a console and one was a handheld. Now, both of these were crudely shown off in different forms, one of them appearing at E3 one year behind some glass cases, and in theory, it seemed pretty cool. A system where you could play your Nintendo 64 in high definition on your television and play cartridges on it. But of course, time kind of came and went, and we never got that product. Hyperkin's never mentioned it ever again, and things just quieted down on that side of things. You had the Warrior 64, which was a Kickstarter or Indiegogo, one of those crowdfunding campaign things, that was essentially supposed to be like an Ultra HDMI N64, but at a fraction of the price. It was supposed to offer you the best visuals possible from a Nintendo 64 system. It was something that was heavily hyped up as well. And then when it actually came out, it wasn't good. It wasn't good at all. The graphics were inaccurate. The colors were completely off. There was tons of input lag that was added into this, and nothing ever really fixed with it either. Now, of course, there are alternatives out there. When you look at FPGA stuff, which mimics, essentially hardware emulation on that side of things. Now, FPGA projects for the N64 have been coming along nicely, but they're still not at a point where they're 100% perfect. Nowhere near that sort of thing. And really, the only other product we know about would be the Analogue 3D. Now, the Analogue 3D sounds great on paper. I've pre-ordered one. I'm really looking forward to it, but I also don't really know anything about this system. I mean, yeah, you can read the spec sheets, you can see what alleged features are going to be a part of this, but how does it make the games look? How do you have 100% compatibility with the entire library with allegedly an FPGA core that you have developed yourself and not really shown anyone anything from it? We're just kind of taking your word on this, and I'm sure Analogue will produce a product that is better than something like the Warrior 64 was. You got to remember, the Warrior 64 and the Hyperkin were definitely going to be just emulation devices. They weren't going to actually be an FPGA core that would be mimicking the real hardware. Essentially, just running an emulator on the system board and then reading and downloading the cartridge that you put into it in order to play the games, much like a lot of these clone systems are. So with all that being said, we have many N64 projects that have either been announced and teased and then never came out. We have projects that have come out. We have projects like the Polymega, which still does not have anywhere near perfect compatibility with your N64 cartridges. And we have the Analogue 3D, which people are kind of wondering, well, how is this going to turn out? I think the main thing to take away from this is that N64 emulation still is a little bit tricky. Now, if you're on a PC or something like that, obviously it's not going to be a big problem. You could do things like upscale stuff, do texture packs and whatnot, and have really no sort of issue with this. But as far as something that's cost effective to actually manufacture and produce, and also make a controller and probably a rumble pack as well so that people get an authentic N64 experience, that's probably one of the big holdups when it comes to an N64 classic from Nintendo themselves. I mean, let's be realistic. Look at Nintendo 64 emulation on the Switch. Now, I mean, it's pretty good, but there have been some rough instances with it as well, such as in Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. You remember that? That was a whole big thing where the emulation was completely off, and it was not accurately mimicking the experience that you would get on an N64. It was changing things visually, and it was not changing things visually in a positive way. If anything, it was a much more negative way. Now, Nintendo themselves have come along and fixed that, but when you look at how that could potentially happen in the first place, you got to realize a lot of these games have a lot more moving parts than the 8-bit and 16-bit counterparts do. Those emulators and those emulation devices have been around forever when it comes to NES and Super Nintendo. There's still not a whole lot of N64 stuff that's out there that actually works really, really well. Now, Nintendo theoretically could create something like that, but even looking at the Wii to the Wii U Virtual Console, like there were differences in the emulators that were being used on things. So I say all that to say, I think people would still really like an N64 classic. And I know that people may say, well, why would Nintendo do that? You know, they have the Nintendo Switch Online service. They obviously have the expansion pack portion of it. If you want to play N64 games, that's the best way to do it. But are you really killing two birds with one stone by doing that? Are people that were going to be interested in the N64 Classic not going to pick up a Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch Online because it already exists? Or would they want to potentially double dip and potentially play different N64 games that are available on the N64 Nintendo Switch Online service? I don't think it's necessarily a big conflict of interest, especially if we're looking at a different price point. Now, I don't think it would necessarily be, too expensive, maybe $120, $150, somewhere around there, because these are bigger games and you're going to have to put more work into it. But that's obviously going to be something that could be potentially an impulse buy comparative to something like a Nintendo Switch, which is obviously a higher investment. There is one bit of hope, though, with this whole thing, and that is the fact that in a absolutely horrifying passage of time, Nintendo 64 will be turning 30 in the year 2026. I still remember the first time I saw and played an N64, and that freaks me out a lot. And I do not like it, and I don't even like saying it, but it is true. When you start to think about anniversaries, Nintendo does like to celebrate anniversaries. So maybe that's when we'll see this thing. And I think if it doesn't happen in 2026, it's never going to happen. You know, maybe it's just too difficult for Nintendo to do, to make a device that would be able to handle all of these games and handle all of it in a way that it's easy to manufacture and, more importantly, cheaper to the consumer than what people would potentially expect it to be. But it is a bit of a missed opportunity. You know, I get it. It's cool to play the N64 games on your Switch Online account. Yeah. But there's something about just gathering around a TV with 4 N64 controllers hooked up that I don't think it actually replicates very well. You know, you can do it with Nintendo Switch Online, but I just feel like that would be a little bit more nostalgic. Something that could be potentially something that gets you some easy money in the end of the day. You know, that's what it's about. The money, whether it's easy or hard, you want as much of it as you can get. Let me know in the comment section down below, though. Do you think that Nintendo will ever do an N64 Classic? Has that window of opportunity kind of sailed when it comes to these systems? Because I really don't think it has. I think if you came out with an N64 Classic, you had Sega do a Dreamcast Classic, a Saturn Classic, like that would reinvigorate the marketplace. Those systems, you know, they have dedicated fan bases. They are something that is indeed exciting. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Be sure to like, comment, and share. Hit the bell notification as well. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.